we can see him!
The sheriff's deputies burst into Sierra Precision Range, weapons drawn. The woman at lane 12 doesn't flinch. She calmly sets down her rifle, the same rifle that just put 15 rounds through a quarter-sized target at 800 yards. No scope adjustments, no wind readings. Impossible shots that made every veteran in the building stop and stare. "Ma'am, you're under arrest." She extends her hands without a word. No ID, no permits, no explanation. Just deadly calm that unnerves the officers more than resistance would. As they escort her out, Rangemaster Bobby Martinez frantically dials a number he hasn't used in years. In the federal courthouse, she sits silent while jurisdictions fight over her case, until heavy oak doors explode open and a Navy admiral storms down the aisle. Everyone freezes. The judge reads sealed documents, and her face goes white. "All charges dismissed. This case is classified." What just happened? 4 hours earlier, dawn broke over the Sierra Nevada mountains, casting long shadows across Northern California's most remote shooting range. Sierra Precision Range sits carved into the mountainside at 4,000 feet elevation, its covered lanes offering protection from the unpredictable mountain winds that separate amateur shooters from true professionals. Bobby Martinez, the range master, arrived at 5:30 a.m. for his usual opening routine. 20 years in the Navy aboard surface vessels, followed by 8 years running this mountain facility, had given him an eye for people. Most shooters he could categorize immediately: hunters preparing for deer season, competitive shooters with their specialized gear, weekend warriors playing tactical games, and the occasional law enforcement officer getting some practice. At 6:15 a.m., a woman in her early 30s walked through the entrance. Unremarkable in every visible way: dark jeans, navy hoodie, worn baseball cap pulled low over brown hair. She carried a long case and moved with deliberate ordinariness, the kind of studied normalcy that actually made her stand out to Bobby's trained eye. She paid cash for lane 12, the farthest from the office. No membership, no range card, just a crisp $20 bill and a polite nod. She set up methodically, assembling her rifle with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. The weapon itself was unremarkable, a standard hunting rifle with basic optics. When she began shooting, Bobby nearly dropped his morning coffee. Her first shots hit dead center at 100 yards. Without adjusting her scope, she switched to the 300-yard targets. Perfect grouping. Then 500 yards, still hitting center mass with mechanical precision that defied explanation. Bobby leaned forward in his elevated observation post, studying her technique through binoculars. Her breathing followed a perfect 4-count, controlled inhale, natural hold, respiratory pause, slow trigger squeeze. Most telling was how she adjusted for the mountain wind without any weather instruments, reading air currents like an open book. The mountain wind at Sierra Precision is notoriously difficult. It swirls around the peaks, creating unpredictable downdrafts and crosswinds that even experienced shooters struggle with. Professional snipers use wind meters, temperature gauges, and ballistic calculators. This woman was reading the wind by feeling it, watching how it moved the grass 600 yards down range, observing the flutter of a plastic bag caught on the safety netting. At 7:30 a.m., she switched to the 800-yard targets, shots that most hunters never attempted. Her rifle cracked 15 times in rapid succession. Through his spotting scope, Bobby watched every round punch through a target area no larger than a quarter. "Excuse me," a nervous patron approached Bobby's booth. "That woman at the end lane, something's not right. She's hitting targets that shouldn't be possible with that setup, and she's got no range badge, no membership card I could see." Bobby nodded slowly, his military instincts triggering. In 20 years of Navy service, he'd met exactly 3 people who could shoot like that without high-end equipment. All 3 had been Navy SEALs. At 8 a.m., Bobby made a decision that would change everything. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. His old Navy buddy, who now worked intelligence at the Pentagon. "Martinez here," he said quietly. "I need you to run something up the chain. I've got someone at my range who's either the best natural shooter I've ever seen, or she's one of ours operating without identification." The response was immediate. Don't approach her. Don't let her leave. We're making some calls. At 8:15 a.m., two Placer County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Sierra Precision Range. They'd received a call about suspicious activity involving unregistered weapons and a person refusing to provide identification. Bobby watched from his booth as they approached the woman. She was still shooting, still hitting impossible targets with casual precision. The deputies positioned themselves tactically, hands near their weapons. "Ma'am, we need to see some identification and your permit for that rifle," the senior deputy called out. The woman turned calmly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer? ID and permit, please." Her response was delivered with the kind of professional calm that Bobby recognized from briefings aboard Navy vessels. "I don't have those with me." A search revealed no wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind. Just a key card with no markings and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be coordinates and wind calculations. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us." The Placer County Sheriff's Office sits in Auburn, California, 30 minutes down the mountain from Sierra Precision Range. It's a modern facility with holding cells, a booking area, and offices designed to handle the routine law enforcement needs of a largely rural county. Sarah Mitchell, though she provided no name during processing, sat silently during fingerprinting, offering no resistance, but providing no information. Name? Silence? Address? Nothing. "You understand that refusing to identify yourself is a crime in California?" the booking officer asked. She met his gaze with steady, calm eyes, but said nothing. Detective Maria Santos took over the interrogation, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for getting people to talk. She tried every technique in her arsenal: friendly conversation, implied threats about federal charges, mentions of cooperation benefits, appeals to reason. Sarah responded with respectful silence to each approach. "Got ourselves a real mystery woman," joked Deputy Williams. "Maybe she's a foreign agent or something." When left alone in her cell, subtle changes appeared in Sarah's demeanor that only someone with security training would recognize. She examined the room with measured precision, noting camera positions, identifying blind spots, timing guard rotations. Through her cell window, she carefully studied the building layout, marking emergency exits and security protocols. Detective Santos ran her fingerprints through every database available. Local came back empty. State databases showed nothing. Federal systems were temporarily down for maintenance. "We'll try federal again tomorrow," Santos told the shift supervisor. Meanwhile, she's not going anywhere. At 2 p.m., everything changed. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives arrived at the sheriff's office. "I understand you have someone in custody with an unregistered weapon capable of precision shooting at extreme range?" Before Santos could respond, Agent Michael Foster from the FBI walked through the door. "Actually, this falls under Bureau jurisdiction. We have reason to believe this relates to an ongoing domestic terrorism investigation." The jurisdictional dispute that followed was unlike anything the rural sheriff's office had ever experienced. ATF wanted the case because of weapons violations. FBI claimed domestic terrorism implications. A representative from Homeland Security arrived an hour later, insisting that potential foreign operative activity fell under their purview. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a 25-year veteran of rural law enforcement, watched the federal circus with growing frustration. "This is still my county, my jail, and my prisoner until a judge says otherwise." Meanwhile, in his booth back at Sierra Precision Range, Bobby Martinez was fielding calls that made him increasingly nervous. His Pentagon contact had called back twice. Someone from Naval Intelligence had requested detailed information about the woman's shooting performance. Most unsettling, someone claiming to be from Naval Special Warfare Command had asked very specific questions about her equipment and technique. "Bobby," his Pentagon contact finally said on the third call, "I need you to listen carefully. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't answer any more questions about her shooting. And whatever you do, don't let anyone remove her equipment from your range." At 4 p.m., Sarah was transferred to the federal building in Sacramento for arraignment. The jurisdictional fight had been temporarily resolved by a federal magistrate who ruled that weapons charges took precedence, meaning she would face a federal judge. During the transport, Detective Santos rode along, still hoping to get some information from their mysterious prisoner. Sarah sat quietly in the back of the federal transport vehicle, hands cuffed, but her eyes continuously scanning the route, noting landmarks, calculating distances, observing security protocols. "You know," Santos said, "we're going to figure out who you are eventually. Cooperation now might help your situation." Sarah's first words in hours were delivered with quiet authority. "Detective, I appreciate that you're doing your job, but some things require patience." The federal courthouse in Sacramento was a different world from the rural sheriff's office. Multiple agencies had staked claims to Sarah's case. Representatives from ATF, FBI, Homeland Security, and even someone from the Department of Defense sat in the gallery. As Sarah was brought into the courtroom for her arraignment, she briefly glanced toward the windows where she could see a naval air station in the distance. For just a moment, the smallest change crossed her expression, not relief, but recognition. Judge Patricia Morrison, herself a former Navy JAG officer, looked irritated as she reviewed the docket. The federal prosecutors couldn't agree on which charges to file. ATF wanted weapons violations. FBI insisted on domestic terrorism charges. Homeland Security was pushing for foreign agent allegations. "Your Honor," said the overworked public defender assigned to Sarah's case, "I'd like to request a continuance. My client has been uncooperative and I haven't been able to prepare adequately." Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "This is still my courtroom. We will proceed with arraignment, and then I will consider the jurisdictional arguments." As the clerk began reading the charges, nobody in the courtroom noticed the black government vehicles pulling up outside. The defendant is charged with possession of an unregistered firearm, refusal to provide identification to law enforcement, and potential violations of federal firearms regulations. The court clerk read in a monotone voice. Sarah Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, her posture perfect, eyes focused forward. She wore an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, but somehow managed to project an aura of calm authority that seemed out of place in the federal courtroom. Detective Santos, seated in the front row, studied her with growing fascination. In 15 years of law enforcement, she'd never encountered anyone quite like this woman. Not the defiance of a career criminal, not the fear of someone in serious trouble, but the patient confidence of someone who knew something everyone else didn't. Behind Santos, the gallery had filled with an unusual collection of observers. Federal agents from multiple agencies, local law enforcement, and several men in dark suits who hadn't identified themselves to anyone. Most intriguingly, Santos noticed at least 3 individuals who carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing, despite wearing civilian clothes. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Morrison asked. Before the public defender could answer, Agent Torres from ATF stood up. "Your Honor, we request immediate federal custody transfer. This case involves weapons that pose a significant threat to public safety." Agent Foster from the FBI was on his feet immediately. "The Bureau objects, Your Honor. Our investigation into domestic terrorism activities takes precedence." Judge Morrison's expression darkened. "Counselors, you will address the court when recognized. This is an arraignment, not a jurisdictional hearing." At Sierra Precision Range, Bobby Martinez was experiencing the most stressful afternoon of his post-Navy career. He'd received 7 phone calls from various federal agencies, each asking detailed questions about Sarah's shooting performance, her equipment, and her behavior. Most unsettling was the call from someone who identified himself only as Commander Walsh from Naval Special Warfare. The conversation had been brief but intense. "Mr. Martinez, I understand you observed the subject's shooting technique. I need specific details about her wind compensation methods." "She read the wind without instruments," Bobby had replied. "Perfect adjustment for mountain conditions. I've seen stump professional snipers." "What about her breathing pattern?" "Textbook 4 count. Better than textbook, actually." "I've only seen that kind of respiratory control from—" "From whom, Mr. Martinez?" Bobby had hesitated. "From SEALs, sir. Only from SEALs." The line had gone quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Martinez, I need you to secure her equipment and allow no one, and I mean no one, to examine or remove it until further notice. This is a matter of national security. Back in the courtroom, the jurisdictional dispute was escalating. Representatives from 4 different federal agencies were arguing over who had primary authority. Sarah remained silent throughout, but Detective Santos noticed she occasionally glanced toward the courtroom's main entrance as if expecting something. "Your Honor," the Homeland Security representative said, "we have reason to believe the defendant may be a foreign operative. Her shooting capabilities suggest professional military training inconsistent with civilian background." For the first time, Sarah's expression changed slightly. It wasn't concern or fear, but what looked almost like amusement. Judge Morrison had reached her limit. "Enough. This court will proceed with arraignment. The jurisdictional disputes can be resolved after we establish the basic facts of this case." She looked directly at Sarah. "Ma'am, you've been charged with serious federal crimes. Do you understand these charges?" Sarah spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom, her voice clear and carrying surprising authority. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the charges. And how do you plead?" Before Sarah could answer, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a force that made everyone turn. Detective Santos felt the hair on her arms stand up as the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. A Navy Admiral in full dress uniform walked through the entrance. His uniform was impeccable, ribbons and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. 2 officers flanked him, equally formal in their appearance. The entire gallery fell silent. Military personnel throughout the room, and Santos now realized there were more than she'd initially noticed, instinctively came to attention. Even Judge Morrison straightened in her chair. The Admiral walked directly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He approached the bench without seeking permission and handed a sealed document to the bailiff. "Your Honor," he said in a voice that commanded absolute attention, "I am Admiral Catherine Torres, Pacific Fleet Command. I have documentation that directly relates to this case." As Judge Morrison broke the seal and began reading, her expression shifted from annoyance to surprise to something approaching shock. "If you believe this woman deserves respect, regardless of what identification she carries, type respect in the comments. This gets much more intense." Judge Morrison read the sealed document twice, her face growing paler with each line. The courtroom remained in absolute silence, the tension so thick it seemed physical. Detective Santos noticed that every person in military dress had remained at attention since the Admiral's entrance. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Morrison looked up. Her voice carried a gravity that transformed the entire proceeding. "In light of this documentation from the Department of Defense, all charges against the defendant are dismissed effective immediately. This case is classified under national security provisions." She banged her gavel with finality. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted in confused murmurs, but Admiral Torres's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Commander Mitchell." At the words Commander Mitchell, every military person present, including 2 bailiffs, several observers, and even Agent Torres, who Detective Santos now realized was former military, snapped to perfect attention in obvious respect. Detective Santos watched in amazement as Sarah's entire demeanor transformed. No longer attempting to be invisible, she stood tall, shoulders squared. The deliberate posture of ordinariness vanished, replaced by unmistakable military bearing that suddenly commanded the room just as powerfully as the Admiral herself. The bailiff quickly removed Sarah's handcuffs. For the first time since her arrest, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying an authority that filled the courtroom. "Admiral Torres, I apologize for the inconvenience this situation has caused." The Admiral's response silenced every conversation in the room. "On the contrary, Commander, the United States Navy apologizes to you." Detective Santos felt her worldview shifting as pieces began falling into place. The impossible shooting accuracy, the calm under pressure, the professional silence during interrogation, the way she'd assessed her cell like someone trained in escape and evasion. "Commander Mitchell," Admiral Torres continued, addressing the room as much as Sarah, "has been operating under classified orders for the past 9 months. The situation required absolute operational security. Judge Morrison, herself a former JAG officer, stood and offered a respectful nod to both the Admiral and Sarah. Admiral Torres, Commander Mitchell, thank you for your service and your understanding of our position. Your Honor, Admiral Torres replied, we appreciate the professionalism shown by all parties involved. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught wind of the unusual federal case clamored for information. Sarah, now changed into civilian clothes provided by the Navy officers, stood beside Admiral Torres near a convoy of black government vehicles. Sheriff Bradley approached them, confusion and respect battling on his weathered face. Admiral, with all due respect, my department deserves some explanation. We've been treating this as a potential terrorist threat. Admiral Torres' response was measured but firm. Sheriff, I understand your concern. Commander Mitchell is one of our most decorated special operators. The details of her assignment remain classified, but I can assure you she poses no threat to your community. Quite the opposite. Detective Santos stepped forward, her detective instincts overriding her intimidation. Commander, I owe you an apology. Sarah met her eyes directly, no longer hiding behind the careful blankness of operational security. Detective Santos, no apology is necessary. You were doing your job, and you did it well. An elderly man wearing a VFW cap approached cautiously. He'd been sitting in the courthouse gallery all morning. Excuse me, ma'am. I was a corpsman with the Marines in Desert Storm. Been sitting in that courtroom watching you, and I knew there was something familiar about the way you carried yourself. He extended his hand with obvious respect. Thank you for your service, whatever it is you do that we'll never hear about. Sarah shook his hand firmly, her professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal genuine warmth. Thank you for yours, corpsman. Your generation taught us everything we know. Admiral Torres checked her watch. Commander Mitchell, we need to proceed. Operation Coastal Shield requires debriefing, and Washington is waiting for your preliminary report. Sheriff Bradley's eyes widened. Coastal Shield? The counterterrorism operation that prevented the coordinated port attacks last year? Admiral Torres remained professionally vague, but her tone carried unmistakable pride. Commander Mitchell has given 11 years of exemplary service to this country. Much of her work will never be publicly acknowledged, which is exactly how she prefers it. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. Commander, will you make a statement about your arrest? No comment, Sarah replied firmly, and I'd appreciate privacy for all parties involved. As they moved toward the waiting vehicles, something remarkable happened. The law enforcement officers present, including those who had arrested and detained her, formed an impromptu honor corridor. The military personnel among them rendered sharp salutes as she passed. Detective Santos watched the scene unfold, finally understanding what had seemed so puzzling about Sarah from the beginning. She hadn't been trying to hide guilt or criminal activity. She'd been trained to hide excellence. As the convoy prepared to leave, Admiral Torres approached Detective Santos one final time. Detective, your thoroughness and persistence have been noted. The Navy is always looking for people with your investigative skills and attention to detail. She handed Santos a business card with minimal information, just a phone number and the Navy seal. If you ever consider a change of career, call that number. Ask for Naval Criminal Investigative Service. As the vehicles disappeared down the highway, Santos stood holding the card, reflecting on the most extraordinary case of her career. She'd arrested one of the nation's most elite special operators and somehow turned it into a job offer. Bobby Martinez, watching from the courthouse steps, rendered a perfect salute to the disappearing convoy. 20 years in the Navy had taught him to recognize excellence, even when it came disguised as ordinary. 3 weeks later, Detective Santos sat in a secure conference room at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia. The walls were lined with photographs of naval operations she couldn't identify, and the men and women around the table carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of people who operated in the shadows. Admiral Torres had made good on her invitation. Santos was attending a classified briefing about Operation Coastal Shield, the counterterrorism operation that had dominated headlines the previous year when it prevented coordinated attacks on 3 major West Coast ports. "Detective Santos," Admiral Torres began, "what you're about to hear is classified at the highest levels. Commander Mitchell's cover was so deep that even we lost track of her for several months." The briefing that followed shattered Santos's understanding of the scope of Sarah's operation. For 9 months, she had infiltrated a domestic terrorist cell planning simultaneous attacks on the ports of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. The attacks, if successful, would have resulted in thousands of casualties and billions in economic damage. "Commander Mitchell established herself in the organization as an expert marksman," explained Captain James Harrison, Sarah's commanding officer. "Her shooting skills, which seemed so suspicious at your mountain range, were actually her credentials within the terrorist network." A map appeared on the screen showing the complex network Sarah had unraveled. Over 9 months, she identified 23 active participants, mapped their command structure, located weapons caches, and documented their complete operational plan. Santos leaned forward. "The shooting demonstration at Sierra Precision Range, was that part of her cover?" "Partly," Captain Harrison replied, "but also operational necessity. She was meeting a contact who would only deal with someone who could demonstrate exceptional shooting ability. Your range was chosen because of its remote location, and because Bobby Martinez's Navy background made it a logical place for someone with military training to practice." The irony wasn't lost on Santos. "So we arrested her while she was actually conducting a counterterrorism operation." "In a sense, yes. But Commander Mitchell adapted to the situation brilliantly. Her arrest and subsequent detention actually provided perfect cover for her extraction from the operation. The terrorist cell believes she was compromised by law enforcement incompetence, not by naval intelligence." Admiral Torres continued the briefing. "The arrests of the terrorist network happened 3 days after Commander Mitchell's courthouse release. 23 individuals in custody, weapons caches secured, attack plans disrupted. The public story mentioned federal law enforcement success based on anonymous tips. The real story is sitting in this room." A new photograph appeared on screen. Sarah, in her formal Navy uniform, standing with Admiral Torres and several other high-ranking officers. The ribbons on her chest told a story of exceptional service that Santos was only beginning to understand. "Commander Mitchell's service record is largely classified," Admiral Torres explained. "But I can tell you she graduated first in her class from basic underwater demolition SEAL training at Coronado. She became one of the first female operators to qualify for Naval Special Warfare Development Group, though this fact remains classified." Santos tried to process the magnitude of what she was learning. "The woman I arrested is essentially a female Navy SEAL?" "There's no essentially about it, Detective. Commander Mitchell is a Navy SEAL and one of our finest. Her specialized training includes advanced marksmanship, underwater operations, counterterrorism, foreign languages, and deep cover operations." The briefing continued with details that made Santos realize how little she'd understood about Sarah's true capabilities. Operation Coastal Shield was just her most recent assignment. Previous operations had taken her to locations and situations that would remain classified for decades. "Her shooting demonstration at your range," Captain Harrison explained, "represented about 10% of her actual capabilities. SEALs trained to standards that most people would consider impossible." Santos thought back to Bobby Martinez's immediate recognition of Sarah's skills. The range master knew something was unusual. Bobby Martinez served 20 years aboard Navy vessels. He'd encountered SEALs before, though never in a civilian setting. His phone call to the Pentagon was actually what initiated our extraction protocol. Admiral Torres leaned back in her chair. "Detective, the reason you're here is that Commander Mitchell specifically requested your presence at this briefing. She was impressed by your investigative persistence and your professionalism throughout a very difficult situation. She wants to recruit me? She wants to offer you the opportunity to be part of something larger than local law enforcement. NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, needs people who can navigate the intersection between military operations and civilian law enforcement. Santos looked around the room at faces she was beginning to recognize as part of an invisible community of people who operated in the shadows, protecting the country in ways the public would never know. What exactly would that involve? Developing protocols for situations like Commander Mitchell's arrest, training law enforcement to recognize when they might be encountering special operators, creating liaison procedures that protect both operations and local authorities. Admiral Torres slid a folder across the table. Your experience with Commander Mitchell has become a case study. We're implementing new procedures based on what happened in California. Santos opened the folder to find a job offer that would change her life completely. 6 months later, Santos stood in the observation booth at Sierra Precision Range, watching Bobby Martinez train a new class of law enforcement officers in special operator recognition protocols. Her NCIS badge felt natural now, though the adjustment from local detective to federal agent had been challenging. The key indicators, Bobby was explaining to the group of sheriffs and police chiefs, aren't what you might expect. It's not about equipment or obvious training. It's about behaviors that suggest a level of professionalism beyond civilian norms. On the firing line, a deliberately planted mystery shooter was demonstrating the same impossible accuracy that had first identified Sarah. The law enforcement officers were learning to recognize the signs: controlled breathing, wind reading without instruments, movement patterns that suggested tactical training. Detective Santos, one of the sheriffs asked, what was your first clue that something was unusual? Santos thought back to that day in the courthouse. Honestly, it was her calm. Not just lack of fear, but professional confidence that suggested she knew something we didn't. That's not normal behavior for someone facing serious federal charges. The training program had become Santos's primary responsibility at NCIS. Based on Sarah's case, the Navy had developed protocols for identifying special operators in civilian encounters and protecting both operational security and local law enforcement interests. Bobby's radio crackled. Range control, we have a situation at Lane 7. Santos and Bobby exchanged glances. Lane 7 was where they'd stationed another test scenario, a shooter displaying advanced tactical skills while using false identification. As they watched, the sheriff's deputies assigned to the exercise approached the lane with textbook caution. Instead of immediately demanding identification, they followed the new protocols. Observe, assess, and contact federal liaison before taking action. Range control, the lead deputy radioed. We have a subject displaying advanced marksmanship capabilities and tactical movement patterns consistent with special operations training. Requesting federal consultation before approach. Santos smiled and keyed her radio. This is NCIS Agent Santos. Approach the subject and request identification, but be prepared for the possibility of encountering active military personnel on classified assignment. The exercise proceeded smoothly. The mystery shooter, actually a Navy SEAL participating in the training, provided appropriate documentation when approached correctly. No arrests, no jurisdictional conflicts, no blown operations. 3 months ago, this same scenario would have resulted in arrests and federal court appearances, Bobby observed. Now we have protocols that protect everyone involved. After the training session, Santos received a call on her secure phone. Agent Santos, this is Commander Mitchell. Santos felt a familiar rush of professional respect. Commander, good to hear from you. How's the new assignment? Classified, but going well. I'm calling because we have a situation that requires your specific expertise. Another shooting range incident? Not exactly. We have a former special operator who's gone missing, last seen at a civilian firearms training facility in Texas. Local law enforcement is treating it as a missing person case, but we have reason to believe he may be operating under deep cover. Santos grabbed her notepad. You need someone who can liaise with local authorities without compromising potential operations. Exactly. And someone who understands how to recognize the difference between a missing person and an operator maintaining cover. I'll be on the next flight to Texas. As Santos packed her gear, she reflected on how dramatically her career had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been a small-town detective. Now she was part of an invisible network that protected some of the nation's most classified operations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bobby Martinez. New shooter at the range today. Hitting impossible targets with basic equipment. Thought you should know. Santos smiled. Some things never changed. There would always be exceptional people operating in plain sight, their capabilities hidden behind ordinary appearances. The difference now was that people like Bobby and herself were trained to recognize them and protect them. She typed back, "Standard protocols. Observe and assess. I'll be back from Texas in 3 days." As her plane lifted off from Sacramento, Santos looked down at the Sierra Nevada mountains where this all began. Somewhere in those mountains, Sierra Precision Range continued its dual mission, serving civilian shooters and providing a safe haven for special operators who needed to practice their skills away from curious eyes. And in training centers across the country, law enforcement officers were learning to recognize excellence when they encountered it, ensuring that the next time someone like Commander Sarah Mitchell needed to maintain cover, the system would protect both the operator and the mission. The invisible war continued, fought by people whose names would never appear in headlines, whose sacrifices would never be publicly acknowledged. But now, at least, they had a network of protectors who understood their value and would ensure their shadows remained safe places for necessary work. Thank you for typing respect in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes whose sacrifices protect our freedom. Support our mission through Buy Me a Coffee, link in the first pinned comment. Until next time, honor never fades.